The sun was a hammer on the cracked earth of the New Mexico borderlands. It beat down on the dust, on the sparse, thorny scrub, and on the brim of Eli Harper's hat. He rode slow, the rhythm of his horse. Gideon, a familiar comfort in a world that offered little of it. The leather of his saddle creaked a steady complaint, a sound he'd come to associate with purpose. For 3 days he'd been following the rumor. A foul whisper carried on the wind from one wretched outpost to the next. A traveling wagon, painted gaudily, that sold cheap whiskey from the front and stolen girls from the back. Eli was not a lawman, not anymore. The badge he'd once worn had been buried along with his wife, Sarah, and their boy, Thomas, victims of a raid that had taught him the bitter lesson that justice was not a thing handed down by judges, but a thing to be carved out of the wilderness with patience and, when necessary, with steel. The ghosts of his wife and son rode with him, their silent presence a constant ache in his chest. They were the reason he was here, chasing a rumor that most men would turn away from. He was paying a debt to their memory, a debt that could never be fully settled. The outpost appeared as a smudge on the horizon, then slowly resolved into a collection of wretched, sun-bleached buildings. It was hardly a town, more like a scar on the landscape, a place where men with no names and dark pasts came to lose themselves in drink and cruelty. A saloon, a livery, and a handful of shacks constituted its whole being. As Eli rode down the single, rutted street, men paused their whittling or their spitting to watch him. They saw a man who was not one of them. He was lean and hard, his face browned by the sun and etched with lines of grief, but his eyes were clear and steady. His clothes were worn but clean. His Colt revolver settled low and familiar on his hip. He moved with a quiet economy, a stillness that was more menacing than any loud threat. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the only place with enough life to hold answers. The air inside was thick with the stench of stale beer, sweat, and despair. Eli's eyes adjusted to the gloom. He saw the card players, the drunks, the men whose gazes slid away from his. He walked to the bar, laid a coin down, and ordered a water. "Heard tell of a wagon train passing through," Eli said, his voice low and even, not looking at the bartender but at the room's reflection in the dirty mirror behind the bar. Painted red and yellow, selling wares. The bartender, a fleshy man with a stained apron, grunted. "Might have seen something of the sort. They're camped out past the dry creek bed. Bad business, that lot." Eli nodded, took a sip of the lukewarm water, and turned to leave. He didn't need to know more. Bad business was his business. He found the camp just where the bartender said, 2 wagons, one a simple supply wagon, the other painted in lurid shades of red and yellow, with faded lettering promising tonics and elixirs. 3 men sat around a low fire, their faces slack with boredom and cheap liquor. They were hard men, the kind who found pleasure in the weakness of others. A hulking man with a tangled black beard, a wiry one with shifty eyes, and a third, their leader by the look of him, a man named Silas with a cruel twist to his mouth. And then he saw her. She was by the garish wagon, scrubbing a pot with a listless, mechanical motion. She was young, maybe 18 or 19, with hair the color of corn silk, though it was matted with dirt and grime. She wore a thin calico dress, torn at the shoulder, and her feet were bare, the soles bruised and cut. When she looked up, her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were vacant, as if the person inside had retreated to a place no one could reach. Eli saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her cheek, the way her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. This was one of them, one of the girls from the rumor. Eli urged Gideon forward, not fast, but with an undeniable purpose that made the 3 men by the fire look up. Their hands drifted toward their pistols. "That's far enough. Stranger!" Silas called out, his voice a gravelly rasp. Eli stopped Gideon a dozen paces away. He didn't dismount. From the back of a horse, a man had an advantage. "I'm here for the girl," he said, his voice calm, carrying easily in the still air. The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The girl ain't for sale to your kind," the bearded one growled. "She's bought and paid for." "I'm not looking to buy," Eli said, his gaze fixed on Silas. He saw the girl flinch at his words, her head ducking lower. "I'm taking her." Silas stood up slowly, a sneer spreading across his face. "You and what army? There's one of you and 3 of us. You ride on out of here, and we'll forget we ever saw you." Eli's hand didn't move. His body remained perfectly still. He simply looked at Silas, his eyes holding a cold, deep promise of violence. It was a look that spoke of things he had seen and done, a look that stripped away the man's bluster and bravado, and showed him the chilling reality of what was about to happen if he did not stand down. "There are 2 ways this goes," Eli said, his voice dropping even lower. "You let her walk over to my horse, and I ride away. Or I kill the 3 of you and take her anyway. The choice is yours, but make it now." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The wiry man licked his lips nervously. The bearded one looked to Silas, his confidence wavering. Silas stared at Eli, searching for a bluff, for any sign of fear or uncertainty. He found none. He saw only a man who had made his peace with dying and was more than ready to take others with him. The cold calculus of survival clicked into place in Silas's mind. The girl wasn't worth it. "She's more trouble than she's worth anyway," Silas spat, trying to salvage a scrap of pride. He gestured dismissively toward her. "Go on, get out of here. He wants you. He can have you." The girl looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. She looked from Silas to Eli, as if unable to comprehend what was happening. She had been a piece of property for so long. The idea of being given away, even in a rescue, was just another transaction she did not understand. "Come on," Eli said, his voice softer now, directed at her. She hesitated, her bare feet rooted to the dusty ground. For a moment, Eli thought she might refuse. He saw the terror in her, a fear not just of the men who had held her, but of him, of the unknown. He represented a change, and any change, even from this hell, was terrifying. He waited, his patience a silent force. Finally, with a shuddering breath, she took a step, then another. She walked toward him, her movements stiff and jerky, her eyes downcast. She didn't look at the men as she passed them, but she could feel their hateful glares on her back. When she reached his horse, she stopped, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. Eli leaned down, not offering a hand, but just waiting. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something behind the emptiness, a spark of defiance, buried deep. She reached up, took hold of the saddle horn, and clumsy with weakness and fear, pulled herself up behind him. Her body was light, almost weightless, and he could feel the fine tremor running through her. Without another word, Eli turned Gideon and rode away from the camp, leaving the 3 men standing in the dust, their hate following him like a shadow. They rode in silence for miles, the sun dipping toward the jagged line of the mountains. The world turned to shades of orange and purple. Eli could feel the girl's rigid posture behind him, her hands clutching the back of his saddle, careful not to touch him. He offered her his canteen once, and she took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. She drank sparingly and handed it back, her throat working as she swallowed. When the light began to fail, Eli found a defensible spot to make camp, a shallow basin protected by a rock outcropping. He dismounted and then reached up to help her down. She slid from the horse's back, her legs unsteady, and stumbled. He caught her by the arm, his grip firm but gentle. Her skin was cold despite the day's heat. She pulled away as if burned, wrapping her arms around herself. "I have some jerky," he said, pulling a strip from his saddlebag. He also offered her a small, hard apple. She took them without a word, retreating to the far side of the rock face to eat, her back to him. Eli unsaddled Gideon, rubbed him down, and started a small fire. He worked with a familiar, practiced efficiency, the small tasks of making camp a ritual that calmed the disquiet in his soul. He didn't press her to talk. He knew that the things she had endured were not stories to be shared easily, if ever. The silence was a language he understood. He had lived with his own for years. When the fire was crackling, casting a warm, flickering light against the rocks, he unrolled his bedroll and laid a spare blanket on the ground a respectable distance away. "That's for you," he said. She finished her meager meal and came closer to the fire, drawn by its warmth. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring into the flames. In the firelight, he could see the details of her face more clearly. She was prettier than he had first realized, with a delicate bone structure and a mouth that might have known how to smile once. Her name was Clara. He'd heard Silas call her that. Clara. It sounded like a prayer. "We'll get to Red Creek in 2 days," he told her, his voice quiet. "There's a stagecoach that runs east from there. You can take it anywhere you want to go." She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. When she finally spoke, her voice was a hoarse whisper, rusty from disuse. "I'm going with you." It was not a question or a request, but a statement. Eli looked at her. "There's nothing for you with me. I don't stay in one place for long." "It doesn't matter," she whispered, her gaze still fixed on the fire. "I'm not going back, and I'm not going alone." He didn't argue. He saw the grim determination in her, the desperate clinging to the one person who had shown her a sliver of decency in what must have felt like a lifetime. He was her rescuer, and for now, he was all she had. Later, as the stars blazed to life in the vast, ink-black sky, she insisted she was not afraid. "I've slept in worse places," she said, her voice trying for a strength it didn't possess. But her hands, clasped around her knees, were trembling so hard he could see the motion in the firelight. He saw the way she startled at every skitter of a lizard in the rocks, the way her eyes darted toward the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Eli knew she was living on the raw edge of her nerves. He stood up. "I'm going to check on the horse. You should get some sleep." He turned his back to her, a conscious act of giving her privacy. In his world, it was a gesture of respect, a way of telling her she was safe, that he would not watch her in a moment of vulnerability. He walked toward the shadows where Gideon was tethered, his footsteps soft on the sandy ground. He heard a rustle of fabric behind him. He assumed she was settling into the blanket, preparing for a long, cold night. He stood with Gideon for a moment, stroking the horse's strong neck, his thoughts drifting to his own past, to another fire, another woman, another life. Then he heard it, a sound so small it was almost lost beneath the whisper of the wind, a choked, quiet sob. It was the sound of utter despair, of a shame so deep it had become the very air she breathed. He turned slowly. In the flickering light of the campfire, he saw her. She was on her knees, her back to him. She had unfastened the top buttons of her dress, and the thin fabric had slipped from one shoulder, exposing the pale skin and the dark, ugly bruise that marred it. Her whole body was shaking with silent weeping. She was undressing, not for sleep, but for him. She was preparing to offer the only thing she believed she was worth, the only currency she had been taught. The sight sent a cold, sharp pang through Eli's chest. It was a pain that went deeper than pity. He saw not just a broken girl, but the embodiment of all the cruelty and ugliness he had sworn to fight. She believed this was what he wanted, what every man wanted. She thought this was the price of her rescue. He didn't speak. Words would be clumsy, loud, and wrong. Instead, he moved with a quiet deliberation. He walked back to the fire, picked up the thick wool blanket he had laid out for her, the one she had ignored. He approached her from behind, his steps measured and soft. She must have heard him, because her weeping hitched, her body tensing for a touch she expected to be rough and demanding. But it never came. Instead, she felt the gentle weight of the blanket settling over her shoulders. It was warm from the fire, heavy and solid. Eli drew it around her, covering her exposed skin. Hiding her from the cold night and from his own eyes, he tucked it around her as if she were a child. Then he sat on the ground beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel his presence, a steady, silent wall between her and the darkness. He didn't touch her again. He just sat there, staring into the fire, his jaw tight. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the sound of her ragged breathing as she tried to stifle her sobs. Finally, her weeping subsided into a shuddering quiet. She whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "You don't want me?" The question was loaded with a lifetime of pain, the final, devastating proof of her worthlessness. If even her rescuer, the man who had faced down others for her, rejected this, then she was truly nothing. Eli continued to stare into the fire, his profile carved by the orange light. He thought of his Sarah, of the gentle love they had shared, a love that had been about warmth and laughter and respect, not a transaction of flesh. He thought of this girl, Clara, whose spirit had been so methodically crushed. He turned his head and looked at her. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide and lost in the dim light. "Not like this," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. It was not a rejection of her, but of the shame that had been forced upon her. It was a refusal of the idea that her body was a payment, in those 3 words. He gave her back a piece of herself she thought was gone forever. Clara stared at him, her lips parted in disbelief. She had expected anger, or disgust, or at the very least, a cold dismissal. She had not expected this quiet, profound respect. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. For the first time since he had found her, the emptiness in her eyes receded, and he saw something else take its place. It was a flicker of light in a deep, dark place. He saw a soul that had been grievously wounded, a spirit that had been bent and battered. He saw something broken, yes, but he also saw, with absolute clarity, that it was not lost. The dawn broke cold and pale, spilling a thin gray light over a world that seemed made of dust and distance. They rode for 2 days, moving through a landscape that was as unforgiving as the silence between them. The plains stretched out in every direction, a vast, sun-scorched canvas of brown and pale green, broken only by the skeletal remains of yucca plants and the occasional rock formation that looked like the bones of some long-dead beast. The only signs of life were the wolf tracks they occasionally crossed in the sandy soil, a stark reminder that they were not alone, that predators were always near. In the afternoons, thunderclouds would build on the far horizon, great purple bruises in the sky that promised a storm that never came, a threat that never materialized, leaving only a tense, electric stillness in the air. Clara rode behind Eli, her body no longer as rigid as it had been that first night, but still held in a posture of wary watchfulness. The blanket he had given her was rolled and tied behind the saddle. He had bought her a pair of sturdy boots and a simple, dark blue dress at a dusty trading post, paying for them with a quiet transaction that asked no questions. She wore the new clothes with a kind of anonymous relief. The hated calico dress burned to ashes in their campfire. The silence between them began to fray at the edges, slowly, tentatively. Her words came in fragments, small pieces of a shattered life offered up like precious, painful relics. One afternoon, while watching a hawk circle high above, she spoke of her father. "He was a preacher," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "He knew all the words in the good book. He said God's love was a shelter from the storm." She paused, her eyes following the hawk's effortless glide. The storm came anyway. Another time, while they watered the horse at a sluggish, muddy creek, she mentioned his death. It was a fever, fast, One Sunday he was preaching about the lilies of the field, and by Wednesday, he was gone. There was no self-pity in her voice, only a flat statement of fact, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. The name of her stepfather was never uttered, but he was a constant, menacing presence in the spaces between her words. He was the man my mother married, a cruel shadow who had taken her father's place in the pulpit and in their home. The warmth had gone out of the house, she said, replaced by a cold, hard piety that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with fear. Eli listened, his face impassive, but his hands would tighten on the reins, his knuckles showing white. The worst of it came out one evening as she stared into the dancing flames of their fire. "He said I had a debt to pay," she murmured, her voice hollow. "My father's debt. He sold me for a debt." The words hung in the air, simple, brutal, and absolute. She did not weep when she said them. The time for tears was long past. All that remained was the cold, hard fact of the betrayal. Eli, for his part, shared almost nothing of himself. He was a closed book, his own history locked away, but his actions spoke a language she was slowly beginning to understand. He always chose a campsite that was sheltered, giving her the most protected spot. He made sure she ate before he did. He never looked at her with pity, but with a quiet, steady regard that was far more comforting. When she would wake from a nightmare with a small, stifled cry, she would find him already awake, sitting on the other side of the fire, his presence a silent assurance that she was not alone in the dark. "You are safe with me," he would say, and the simple declaration was a promise more solid than any she had ever known. On the third day, they saw the town of Red Creek. It was a proper town, not just an outpost, with a church steeple piercing the sky and a line of false-fronted buildings along a wide, dusty main street. For Eli, it meant a stagecoach and a chance for Clara to start over. For Clara, it meant people. It meant eyes. It meant judgment. As they rode down the street, a palpable tension settled over her. She hunched her shoulders, pulling her shawl tighter, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. But she was not invisible. A woman riding on the back of a hard-faced cowboy was a spectacle. Heads turned, people stopped and stared. Men on the boardwalk of the general store nudged each other, their leering grins making her feel as if she were still in the garish red and yellow wagon. Women looked at her with a particular kind of contempt, a mixture of moral superiority and suspicion. They saw her worn dress, her haunted eyes, the way she clung to the saddle behind a stranger, and they made their assumptions. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Eli's plan was to inquire about the stagecoach schedule and find her a room at the boarding house, a safe place for her to stay until the coach departed. As Clara slid to the ground, a woman in a severe black dress and a tightly pinned bun swept past them. Her lips pursed in disapproval. She took one look at Clara, at her pale, frightened face, and her expression hardened into one of pure disgust. The woman turned her head and spat on the ground, a deliberate, venomous gesture that landed in the dust just inches from Clara's new boots. The act was as sharp and stunning as a slap in the face. All the fragile progress Clara had made over the past few days shattered. The air rushed from her lungs. The whispers and stares of the other townsfolk seemed to grow louder, pressing in on her, confirming the terrible truth she carried inside her. She was filth. She was ruined. She was nothing. Without a word, she shrank back, pressing herself against Eli's side, hiding her face in the rough fabric of his coat like a terrified child. Eli felt the tremor that ran through her body. He looked down at the top of her head, at the corn silk hair pressed against his chest. He saw the gob of spit in the dust, a cold, quiet rage, an emotion he knew intimately, began to build within him. It was a controlled burn, not a wildfire. He placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, a steadying, protective gesture. and then he lifted his head, his eyes scanning the faces on the street. His gaze settled on the sheriff, a portly man with a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest, who had been watching the exchange from the doorway of his office with a look of lazy amusement. Eli's expression did not change, but a stillness came over him, the dangerous calm before a strike. He left Clara by the horse and walked toward the sheriff, his steps measured and deliberate. The whispers on the street died down. The leering men at the general store fell silent. Everyone watched. Eli stopped directly in front of the sheriff. He was taller than the lawmen, and leaner, and he seemed to emanate a cold authority that had nothing to do with a badge. "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice level, almost conversational. Yet it carried an edge of tempered steel that made the hairs on the back of the sheriff's neck stand up. "What can I do for you, stranger?" the sheriff asked, trying for a blustering tone that came out as a weak imitation of confidence. "That woman," Eli said, nodding his head slightly in the direction the woman in black had gone. "And these others, they seem to think this town is their personal church, and they're free to cast stones at anyone they see fit." The sheriff shrugged, a fleshy roll of his shoulders. "A man can't be responsible for the moral opinions of his townsfolk. The lady, well, folks around here have standards." He glanced over at Clara, who was still hiding by the horse, and a smirk touched his lips. The smirk vanished when he looked back at Eli. He saw something in the stranger's eyes that made his blood run cold. It was not the hot anger of a brawler. It was a deep, chilling fury, a look that promised a methodical and absolute destruction. It was the look of a man who had seen the absolute worst of what men could do to each other and had survived it. "Standards," Eli repeated, the word tasting like poison. He took a small step closer, invading the sheriff's space. "Let me tell you about standards. Sheriff, I have a standard that says a man, especially a man wearing a badge, has a duty to protect the weak, not stand by while the self-righteous and the cruel spit on a girl who has already been through more than they could ever imagine." His voice never rose above a low, intense murmur, but every word was a hammer blow. The men on the boardwalk, who had been enjoying the show, now looked uneasy. "Now, I'm not asking you to change the hearts of your people," Eli continued, his eyes locked on the sheriff's. "That would be a miracle beyond even my abilities. But I am telling you what is going to happen. I am going to take this young lady to the boarding house. She is going to have a hot meal and a clean bed, and while she is in this town, she will be treated with respect. No one will whisper, no one will stare, and no one," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "will so much as look at her sideways. Do you understand me?" The sheriff swallowed hard, his face pale. He was a man accustomed to dealing with drunken cowboys and petty thieves. He had never been confronted by a man like this, a man whose quiet wrath was more terrifying than any loud threat. He saw the truth of the situation not in Eli's words, but in the lethal promise in his eyes. This man would not start a gunfight in the middle of the street. It would be something worse, something more personal. He would find the sheriff alone, in the dark, and settle this matter in a way that would leave no witnesses. I understand," the sheriff stammered, his authority completely stripped away. "Good," Eli said. He held the sheriff's gaze for a moment longer, then turned his back and walked away. The confrontation over. He went to Clara, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you that room." The walk to the boarding house was a study in silence. The street, which had been buzzing with gossip just moments before, was now unnervingly quiet. People averted their gazes. The men on the boardwalk suddenly found their boots fascinating. Eli had not drawn his gun, had not raised his voice, but he had cowed the entire town with the sheer force of his will. He had defended Clara's dignity, not with violence, but with a restrained fury that was far more potent. But the victory was lost on Clara. The boarding house room was clean, the meal was hot, but she could not escape the feeling of the woman's spit in the dust. She could not unhear the whispers, Eli's defense of her, as magnificent as it was, had only served to highlight her shame. He had stood up for a ruined woman. He had silenced a town for a whore. That night, the weight of it all became too much to bear. Eli had taken a room across the hall. He had told her to rest, that the stagecoach for St. Louis left in the morning. He had given her a way out, a path to a new life, but she could not see it. All she could see was a long, endless road of towns just like this one, of women in black dresses and men with leering eyes. She saw a lifetime of being what she had become. She lay in the dark, the clean sheets a mockery against her skin. She was poison. She had brought trouble to this man who had only shown her kindness. She would continue to bring him trouble. He deserved better. Everyone deserved better than her. The thought solidified into a desperate, frantic plan. She had to run, not from him, but for him. She had to disappear, so he could be free of her taint. Quietly, she slipped out of the bed. She dressed in the darkness, her movements furtive and silent. She eased her door open, cringing at the small creak of the hinges. The hallway was empty. Eli's door was closed. Holding her breath, she crept down the stairs and out the back door of the boarding house, into the cold night air. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran, her feet pounding against the hard-packed earth, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She ran past the darkened houses, past the livery, toward the sound of running water she had heard earlier. She stumbled through a patch of woods and finally collapsed on the damp bank of a creek, the sound of the gurgling water filling the silence. There, she let the sobs come. Great, heaving waves of grief and self-loathing that shook her entire body. She curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her knees, and wept for the girl she had been, for the woman she could never be. "I can't be loved," she whispered to the unhearing water, the words a raw, painful admission of her deepest truth. "No one, never." She did not know how long she had been there when she heard a twig snap behind her. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was him. Eli stood in the moonlight, his face etched with concern. He did not look angry. He simply looked at her, his gaze taking in her huddled, miserable form. He walked over and knelt beside her on the damp ground. The moonlight shone on the tear tracks on her face. "I heard you go," he said, his voice quiet. She couldn't look at him. She stared at the dark, swirling water of the creek. "You should have let me," she choked out. "I'm no good. I bring trouble. You saw them. You saw how they look at me. That's how everyone will always look at me." "I don't look at you that way," he said. "You're different," she whispered. "You're good. I'm not. I wanted to pay you back for saving me. That first night. That's all I know how to do. But you didn't want it, because I'm not worth wanting." The pain in her voice was so raw, so profound. It struck Eli to the core. He finally understood the depth of her despair. It wasn't just about the shame. It was about the crushing belief that she had no other value. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her wet cheek. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "Clara," he said, his voice low and earnest. "What those men did to you, that's a debt they'll have to pay. Not you, what I did, saving you, that doesn't require a payment. It's not a transaction. I don't want your gratitude. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything." He paused, searching for the right words, the words that would pierce through the armor of her shame. "What I want," he said, his voice thick with an unfamiliar emotion. "It's for you to choose. I want you to get on that stagecoach tomorrow because you choose to, or to stay, or to go somewhere else. I want you to make a choice for yourself. Not because you're running away, or because you think you have to pay a debt, or because you think it's what I want. For the first time in a long time, I want you to choose what you want, if and when you are ready." His words were a revelation. They were not words of pity, or even of comfort. They were words of empowerment. He was not offering her a future. He was telling her she had the right to build her own. He was giving her back her own life. She finally lifted her head and looked at him. In the pale moonlight, his face was serious, his eyes filled with a sincerity that was absolute. She saw the truth of his words reflected there. He did not see a ruined woman. He saw her, Clara. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, the sound of a burden being set down after a long and weary journey. The sobs subsided. The frantic energy that had propelled her into the night drained away, leaving only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She was so tired. Without thinking, she leaned sideways, her head coming to rest against his shoulder. She expected him to stiffen, to pull away, but he didn't. He remained perfectly still, a solid, unmovable presence in the darkness. He was warm, and he was safe. He slowly raised an arm and wrapped it around her shoulders, holding her gently. It was not the embrace of a lover, but of a protector, a guardian. It was an embrace that asked for nothing and offered everything. She closed her eyes. The sound of the creek and the steady beat of his heart a soothing lullaby. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a flicker of something she had long forgotten, hope. And there, on the bank of a lonely creek in the middle of the night, held in the arms of a quiet, grieving cowboy, Clara fell asleep. The stagecoach did not go to St. Louis. When morning came, Clara stood in the boarding-house room, the ticket Eli had bought for her held loosely in her hand. He stood by the door, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. He did not ask her what she wanted to do. He simply waited for her to make the choice he had given her the night before. She looked at the ticket, a flimsy piece of paper that promised a future she could not yet imagine. And then she looked at him, the only solid thing in her life. "I don't know anyone in St. Louis," she said, her voice small but clear. "I don't know anyone anywhere, except you." A flicker of something, relief, perhaps, or a heavier sense of responsibility, passed through his eyes. He nodded once. "All right then, there is a place we can go. Some friends of mine. It's a few days' ride from here. We can rest there, figure things out." She folded the ticket and laid it on the dresser. When she turned back to him, she met his gaze directly for the first time. "Thank you, Eli." He just nodded again, put on his hat, and led the way out of the town that had judged her, and back into the wide, empty country that did not care what she was, only that she survived. They rode north for 3 days, leaving the arid plains behind and climbing into a landscape of rolling hills dotted with oak and pine. The air grew cooler, cleaner. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer a space filled with unspoken trauma, but a comfortable quiet, a shared solitude. Clara found herself watching him, the easy way he sat in the saddle, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, missing nothing. He was a man at home in the wilderness, a part of its harsh and silent beauty. Late on the 3rd day, they crested a hill and looked down into a long, green valley. A creek snaked through it, its banks lined with cottonwoods, and nestled in a crook of the waterway was a ranch. It was not a large operation, but it was well kept. A sturdy log house with smoke curling from its chimney sat surrounded by neat fences, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. It looked peaceful, an island of order in the vast, untamed land. "This is it," Eli said, "the Miller place." As they rode down into the valley, a man came out onto the porch of the house. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind, weathered face and a full beard just starting to gray. He raised a hand in greeting. "Eli Harper, as I live and breathe," the man called out, his voice a warm, welcoming boom. He came down the steps, a wide smile on his face. "It has been too long." Eli dismounted and clasped the man's hand. "Samuel, it is good to see you." Just then, the door opened again, and a woman came out, wiping her hands on an apron. She was not a classically beautiful woman. but her face was filled with a strength and warmth that was more compelling than any simple prettiness. Her brown hair was woven into a practical braid, and her eyes, the color of rich earth, were clear and direct. Two small children, a boy of about 7 and a girl of 5, peeked out from behind her skirts. "Eli!" she exclaimed, her face breaking into a smile that mirrored her husband's. She came forward and gave him a brief, heartfelt hug. "We were wondering when you would drift this way again." "Ruth, Samuel," Eli said, stepping back. His gaze shifted to Clara, who had slid from the horse's back and now stood uncertainly, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. "This is Clara. She's traveling with me. We need a place to stay for a few days, if it is not too much trouble." Ruth's warm gaze fell upon Clara. For a moment, Clara braced herself for the look she had come to expect, the flicker of judgment, the pursed lips of disapproval, but it never came. Ruth's eyes held nothing but a gentle, open-hearted curiosity. She saw Clara's worn dress, the shadows under her eyes, and the way she held herself as if expecting a blow, and her expression softened with a deep, immediate compassion. "It is no trouble at all," Ruth said, her voice as comforting as a warm blanket. "Any friend of Eli's is a friend of ours. Come inside. Child, you look worn out." Clara hesitated, overwhelmed by this unconditional welcome. She looked at Eli, a silent question in her eyes. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. She took a tentative step forward, and Ruth came to meet her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. The touch was firm and reassuring. "I'm Ruth," she said simply, "and this is my husband, Samuel. The little ones are Jacob and Sarah. You are welcome in our home." The inside of the house was filled with the scent of baking bread and wood smoke. It was clean and orderly, a simple home filled with the quiet hum of family life. It was so different from any place Clara had been in years that it felt like another world. She was given a small room at the back of the house, with a soft bed covered in a handmade quilt, and a window that looked out over the creek. When Ruth brought her a pitcher of warm water and a clean towel, Clara could only whisper her thanks, her throat thick with emotion. To be treated with such simple, uncomplicated kindness was a shock to her system. She did not know how to react. Part of her was suspicious, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the price of this kindness to be revealed. But another, smaller part of her, a part she thought had died long ago, felt a fragile, trembling hope. The next few days passed in a strange, dreamlike haze for Clara. She watched the rhythm of life on the ranch, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Samuel and Eli were up before dawn, their quiet voices a low murmur in the kitchen as they drank coffee before heading out to work. Ruth was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, tending to the children, the garden, the chickens, and the house with a tireless energy that was rooted in love, not obligation. Clara tried to help, but her efforts were clumsy. She had never been taught the domestic arts. Her life had been one of piety and books, and then something else entirely. But Ruth was patient. She showed Clara how to knead bread, how to mend a tear in Jacob's trousers, how to gather eggs without startling the hens. She never condescended. She treated Clara not as a broken creature to be pitied, but as a young woman who simply had things to learn. She spoke to Clara as she would a sister, sharing stories about her own life, about meeting Samuel when they were both working to help runaway slaves find their way to freedom in the North. "We have always believed that you do not turn your back on someone in need," Ruth told her one afternoon as they sat on the porch shelling peas. "It does not matter who they are or where they have been. All that matters is that they need a safe harbor." Clara listened, the words sinking in slowly. A safe harbor. The concept was so foreign, yet so deeply longed for. She spent hours watching Eli. She saw a side of him that she had not known existed. The hard, silent man of the trail was still there, but here, in this place of peace, something else emerged. She watched him work alongside Samuel, repairing a long stretch of fence that had been damaged in a winter storm. He worked with a quiet competence, his movement strong and sure. There was a simple dignity in his labor, in the act of building and mending. But it was his interactions with the children that truly captivated her. She saw him one afternoon with young Jacob, who was struggling to carve a piece of wood into the shape of a horse. Eli sat with him on the steps of the barn, and with his own knife, he showed the boy how to follow the grain of the wood, how to make small, careful cuts. His large, calloused hands that were so capable of violence, were incredibly gentle as he guided the boy's smaller ones. He spoke to Jacob in a low, patient voice, and the boy looked up at him with open admiration. Later, she saw him help little Sarah untangle her kite from the branches of a tall cottonwood tree. Instead of simply pulling it down, he lifted the small girl onto his shoulders, her squeals of delight filling the air as she reached up and freed the kite herself. When he set her back down, she threw her arms around his leg in a hug, and for a fleeting moment, Clara saw Eli's hand rest on the top of the girl's head, a gesture of such profound, unconscious tenderness that it made Clara's breath catch in her throat. In those moments, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to stir within her. It was a flicker of longing, so sharp and painful it was almost a physical ache. She saw in him not just a rescuer, but a man who knew how to be gentle, a man who could build and protect, a man who could have been a husband, a father. She saw the ghost of the life that had been stolen from her, a life of simple warmth and love, and she yearned for it with an intensity that frightened her. That evening, as Clara was helping Ruth fold the clean laundry, the weight of her own unworthiness pressed down on her again. How could she be here, in this good and decent home? How could she watch this family, this man, and dare to feel anything but the shame of what she was? Ruth, with her uncanny perception, seemed to sense the shift in Clara's mood. She paused, a freshly folded sheet in her hands, and looked at Clara with her kind, steady gaze. "You are thinking too hard, child," she said softly. Clara looked down, her hands stilling on a small, worn shirt. "I do not belong here," she whispered. "I am not like you." "No," Ruth agreed, her voice gentle but firm. "You are not. Your path has been harder, but that does not make you less." She set the sheet down and turned to face Clara fully. "I see the way you look at the world, like you are waiting for it to strike you. I see the way you carry your past, like a shroud you can never take off. You think you are ruined, a spoiled thing." Clara flinched, the words striking too close to the bone. She could not meet Ruth's eyes. "Look at me, Clara," Ruth insisted. Clara reluctantly lifted her head. "You have been through fire. I can only imagine the flames. But you are still here. You are still breathing. You are still standing in my kitchen, holding my son's shirt. Do you not see? That means something. It means you survived. Survival is not a sin. It is a victory." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot and sudden. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Her stepfather had spoken of damnation. Silas and his men had spoken of her as property. The woman in Red Creek had spat at her. But no one had ever spoken of her as a victor. "Do not let them take your future from you, Clara," Ruth finished, her voice a fierce, protective whisper. "They have already taken too much." That night, the conversation with Ruth and the images of Eli with the children swirled in Clara's mind as she drifted off to sleep. But her sleep was not peaceful. The fragile walls she had built around her memories crumbled, and the darkness rushed in. She was back in the wagon, the air thick with the smell of cheap perfume and stale whiskey. She heard the rough laughter of men, felt the suffocating weight of a body on top of her. A hand was clamped over her mouth, stifling her cries. She was trapped, helpless, her soul shrinking into a tiny, terrified point of light. She thrashed against the phantom weight, her own muffled whimpers trapped in her throat. The terror was absolute, a black, suffocating wave. And then it found its voice. A scream, raw and piercing, tore through the quiet of the night. Eli came awake instantly, the scream pulling him from a shallow, restless sleep. He was out of his bed and in the hallway before he was fully conscious, his instincts honed by years of sleeping with one ear open. The sound had come from Clara's room. He pushed her door open without knocking. The room was dark, but the moonlight filtering through the window was enough to see her form on the bed, thrashing in the grip of the nightmare. She was fighting, her hands beating at the empty air, small, desperate sounds catching in her throat. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent, not wanting to startle her further but needing to pull her from the depths of her terror. He moved to the side of the bed. "Clara, wake up, you are safe." His voice seemed to penetrate the horror. Her thrashing stilled. Her eyes flew open, wide and unseeing, glazed with fear. She stared at the dark shape of the man looming over her, and for a terrible moment, her dream and reality merged. A fresh wave of panic seized her. "No," she whimpered, scrambling backward on the bed until she hit the wall. "Please, no." "It's me, Clara," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "It's Eli. You are on the Miller Ranch. You are safe. It was just a dream." His name, his voice, finally broke through. Her breathing was coming in great, ragged gasps. The terror in her eyes slowly receded, replaced by a dawning, horrified recognition. She was here, in this safe room, and he was here with her. She had screamed. She had brought the ugliness of her past into this peaceful home. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I did not mean to." "It is all right," he said, his voice still quiet. He did not move closer, giving her space. But she could not bear the space. The darkness of the room felt vast and menacing, filled with the ghosts of her nightmare. The terror still clung to her, a cold sweat on her skin. She needed an anchor. She needed to know he was real, that this safety was real. "Do not leave me," she whispered, the words a raw, desperate plea. He did not answer, but he did not leave. He simply stood there, a solid, reassuring presence in the dark. She held out a trembling hand, a silent, imploring gesture. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before he sat on the edge of the bed and took her offered hand. His hand was large and warm, his skin calloused from work and from gripping the reins of a horse and the handle of a gun. It enveloped her smaller, colder one. His grip was not tight, but it was firm, an anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. She clung to his hand as if it were a lifeline, her fingers curling around his. She could feel the steady, slow pulse in his wrist, a rhythm that was calm and strong. The frantic beating of her own heart began to slow, matching his. The last of her terror ebbed away, replaced by something else, something soft and serious that settled in the quiet space between them. They sat like that for a long time, in the moonlit darkness, without speaking. It was nothing more than two hands clasped together. But in that simple touch, something profound shifted. It was a connection that went deeper than words, a silent acknowledgement of her pain and his steadfast protection. It was not the touch of a lover, or a father, or a brother. It was something new, something that had no name. It was the meeting of two lonely, wounded souls in the dark. Just before dawn, Eli heard a sound from outside. It was faint, the nicker of a horse that did not belong to the ranch. He gently extracted his hand from Clara's, her breathing now deep and even in sleep, and moved to the window. He peered out into the pre-dawn gloom. For a long time, he saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the barn and the trees. Then, he saw it, a flicker of movement on the ridge overlooking the valley. A single rider, silhouetted against the pale, eastern sky. The man sat on his horse for a long moment, a dark, motionless sentinel, before turning and disappearing over the rise. Eli's body went still. It could have been a stray rancher, a lost traveler, but he knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in his gut, that it was not. He recognized the way the man sat his horse, the predatory stillness of him. They had been found. The past that Clara was running from had caught up to them. He stood by the window until the sun came up, watching the sleeping girl in the bed. A fierce, protective anger burned in him. This place, this family, this fragile peace they had found. He would not let it be destroyed. He walked out of her room, closing the door softly behind him. The time for healing was over. The time for confrontation had come. The quiet of the next morning was a lie. Eli felt it in the crisp air, in the unnatural stillness of the birds. He had told Samuel what he had seen, and the two men moved with a grim, understated purpose. There was no panic, only a steady preparation. Samuel, a man who had faced down slave catchers and stood for his convictions when it was dangerous to do so, did not hesitate. His family, his home, and the people he sheltered were not things he would give up without a fight. Ruth, when she was told, simply nodded, her face becoming a mask of calm resolve. She gathered the children, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice as she led them to the root cellar, a small, secure space beneath the kitchen. She gave Clara a quick, fierce hug. "Stay with Eli," she commanded, her voice a steel whisper. "He will keep you safe." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The peace she had so tentatively begun to feel had been a mirage. She had brought this danger to their door. The idyllic ranch, this sanctuary, was about to become a battlefield because of her. The guilt was a physical thing, a sickness in the pit of her stomach. Eli pressed a rifle into her hands. It was heavy and unfamiliar. "Stay in the house, away from the windows," he ordered, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He showed her quickly how to load it. "You probably will not need it, but if you do, point it and pull the trigger. Do not hesitate." Then he and Samuel were gone, taking up positions behind a low stone wall that bordered the main yard. Clara was left in the sudden, echoing silence of the house. She crouched below a window, the rifle clutched in her trembling hands, and waited. The wait was the worst part. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every creak of the house a footstep. Time stretched and warped, each second an eternity. Then she heard it for real, the thunder of approaching horses, a sound of raw, malevolent power. They came over the rise, not one rider, but 6. Silas was at their head, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. The man with the tangled black beard was there, and 4 others, all of them with the same hard, cruel look in their eyes. They rode not like cowboys, but like a pack of wolves descending on a fold. The world erupted in chaos. The first shot was a deafening crack that made Clara jump, the sound of a rifle from the stone wall. One of the riders cried out and pitched from his saddle. The others immediately scattered, using their horses for cover as they returned fire. The air was filled with the roar of guns, the whinny of frightened horses, and the splintering sound of bullets slamming into the log walls of the house. Clara pressed herself against the floor, her breath coming in ragged sobs. This was her fault. This violence, this terror visited upon a good family, was because of her. She could hear Eli and Samuel firing in a steady, controlled rhythm. They were good, she realized. They were not firing wildly, but taking careful aim. Another rider went down, his horse stumbling and falling with him. But there were still 4 of them. They were dismounted now, working their way closer, using the barn and the outbuildings for cover. A bullet shattered the window above Clara's head, showering her with glass. She cried out, crawling away from the danger. The smell of gunpowder was thick in the air, acrid and terrifying. Through the broken window, she saw a man with a wiry frame, the one with the shifty eyes from the camp, make a dash for the house. He was low to the ground, moving fast. Samuel was pinned down, and Eli was focused on 2 other men near the barn. No one saw him. No one but her. He was going to get inside. He was going to come for her, for Ruth and the children. The terror that had paralyzed her was suddenly burned away by a different kind of fire. It was the memory of Ruth's hug, of Samuel's kind smile, of Eli's hand holding hers in the dark. Her hands, which had been trembling, grew steady on the stock of the rifle. She remembered what Eli had said. "Point it and pull the trigger. Do not hesitate." She pushed herself up, resting the heavy barrel on the windowsill. She saw the man, his back to her now, reaching for the handle of the kitchen door. She pointed the rifle, the front sight wavering as she tried to line it up with his back. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder. A brutal, shocking force. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was deafening. When she opened her eyes, the man was lying face down on the porch, motionless. Nausea rose in her throat, hot and bitter. She dropped the rifle as if it were a hot coal and scrambled back, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. The firing outside seemed to falter. The remaining 3 attackers, seeing their numbers suddenly and unexpectedly reduced, lost their nerve. Silas screamed a curse, a sound of pure frustration and rage. There was a final sporadic exchange of shots, and then the sound of horses riding away. Fast. Silence descended, a silence that was more shocking than the noise had been. It was a long moment before Eli's voice cut through it. "Clara, are you all right?" She couldn't answer. She could only kneel on the floor, shaking, staring at the rifle she had dropped. The door opened and Eli came in, his Colt in his hand, his face grim and smudged with gunpowder. He took in the scene at a glance, the shattered window, the rifle on the floor, her huddled form. His eyes went to the body on the porch, and then back to her. A muscle worked in his jaw. He said nothing, but he crossed the room and knelt in front of her, holstering his pistol. He reached out and gently took her by the shoulders. "It is over," he said, his voice quiet. "They are gone." Samuel came in then, his face pale but resolute. He looked at Clara with a new respect in his eyes. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That man would have been inside if not for you." But his words were no comfort. She had taken a life. The act had stained her, just as surely as the hands of Silas's men had. The violence she had been running from was now inside her. Ruth and the children emerged from the cellar, safe but terrified. As Ruth rushed to embrace her husband, Clara felt a profound and terrible sense of alienation. She did not belong here. She was a harbinger of death. One of the men had escaped. Eli had seen him, the wiry man's partner, break from the fight and gallop away over the ridge, a messenger of the violence to come. They would be back, and with more men. The ranch was no longer safe. Later, after the grim task of dealing with the dead was done, Clara found Eli by the barn, reloading his weapons. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed cruelly beautiful after the day's ugliness. "This is my fault," she said, her voice a dead monotone. "All of this." He did not look up from his work. "This is their fault. They chose to come here." "But they came for me," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate urgency. "If I am not here, they will leave these people alone. You have to let me go. Eli, I will ride out. Let them take me. It is the only way to keep everyone safe." He stopped what he was doing and finally looked at her. His face was hard, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He walked toward her until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "No," he said, his voice low and absolute. "You do not understand," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "They will not stop. They will come back, and they will kill all of you to get to me." "Let them try," he said, his voice a low growl. He reached out and gripped her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh, not with cruelty, but with a fierce, undeniable intensity. "Listen to me, Clara. You are not a piece of property to be traded. What happened today? You did what you had to do to survive, to protect people. That does not make you like them. It makes you a fighter." He leaned in closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You do not belong to them anymore," he said, each word a vow. "You are not leaving." His refusal was so absolute, so final, that it left no room for argument. It was not a choice he was giving her. It was a fact he was stating. In that moment, he was not just her protector. He was her champion, her fortress. He was claiming her, not as a possession, but as a person whose life he would defend to his last breath. They left that night, under the cover of a moonless sky. Samuel pressed supplies on them, food, ammunition, a second horse for Clara. Ruth hugged Clara tightly. "Be safe, child," she whispered. There were tears in her eyes. They rode into the mountains, a dark, looming mass against the starry sky. The terrain grew steep and treacherous, their progress slow and difficult. For 2 days they pushed onward and upward, Eli navigating by instinct, his senses on high alert. He knew they were being followed. He could feel it, a prickling on the back of his neck. He saw the signs, a displaced rock, a broken branch that was too fresh. Silas was on their trail, patient and relentless. On the 3rd day, the weather turned. The sky turned a bruised leaden gray, and a cold. Sharp wind began to howl through the pines. Then, the first flakes of snow began to fall. At first, they were light, melting as they hit the ground. But soon they grew thicker, heavier, coming down in a blinding, silent curtain that transformed the world into a landscape of white and gray. The snow was both a blessing and a curse. It would cover their tracks, but it also made travel nearly impossible. The cold was a physical enemy, seeping through their clothes, chilling them to the bone. Their food began to run low. The world shrank to a desperate, moment-by-moment struggle for survival. That evening, as the light began to fail, Eli found a shallow cave set into a rock face, partially hidden by a stand of snow-laden firs. It was not much, but it was shelter from the relentless wind and snow. They built a small, smoky fire just inside the entrance, its warmth a fragile defense against the encroaching cold. They sat huddled together, sharing the last of their jerky and a handful of dried apples. The silence in the cave was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful sound of the wind outside. They were trapped, isolated from the world, with only each other for warmth and company. In the flickering light of the fire, Clara watched Eli. His face was grim, etched with exhaustion and worry. She saw the immense weight he carried, the responsibility for her life resting squarely on his shoulders. He had not spoken of the fight at the ranch, or of the man she had shot. He had simply treated her with a quiet, unwavering gentleness. "I keep thinking about that man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The one at the ranch." Eli's gaze shifted from the fire to her. "Do not," he said. "You did what you had to do." "It is not that simple," she said, shaking her head. "The things they did to me, they were not just to my body. They tried to kill what was inside me. They wanted me to believe I was nothing. Worthless." She paused, hugging her knees to her chest. "There was one of them, the one who hurt me the most. He used to whisper things to me, in the dark." She took a shuddering breath, the memory still so vivid it made her skin crawl. "He told me that no one would ever want me again, that I was spoiled goods, that even if I ever got away, I would be alone forever, because no good man would ever touch something so used." The words came out, raw and painful, the deepest, most poisonous wound she carried. She finally looked at Eli, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, expecting to see pity, or perhaps even a confirmation of those terrible words. But Eli's face had hardened into a mask of cold fury. His expression was more terrifying than any she had ever seen on him. It was a look of pure, murderous rage, directed not at her, but at the phantom who had spoken those words. He reached across the small space between them and cupped her chin, his calloused thumb gently stroking her skin. "He was wrong," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl, filled with a conviction that was absolute. The simple, powerful words were a balm on her wounded soul. He did not offer empty platitudes or reassurances. He stated a fact, a truth that was as solid and real as the rock walls of the cave around them. Tears spilled from her eyes, tears of gratitude and relief. She looked at him, at this closed-off, silent man who spoke so little but whose actions and rare words held so much power. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you do this? Why do you care what happens to me? You never let yourself feel anything. It is like you are made of stone." He let his hand drop from her face and stared into the fire, his own ghosts swirling in the flames. The question seemed to hang in the air for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, choked with a pain that he had held inside for years. "I was not always like this," he said, his gaze distant. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a son, Thomas. He was 5 years old." He spoke the names as if they were sacred, fragile things. "We had a small farm, west of the Brazos. I was a deputy then. There was a gang, not unlike Silas and his men. I was out on a posse, hunting them. I was gone for 3 days. I was doing my duty." His voice broke, and he stopped, swallowing hard against the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. "When I came back, they had been there. The gang. They had doubled back. They took everything. They burned the house, the barn." He closed his eyes, the images playing behind them, as fresh as if it were yesterday. "Sarah and Thomas. I was not there to protect them. I was out chasing monsters, and the monsters came to my home. I failed them." He opened his eyes, and the raw, naked agony in them made Clara's own heart ache. "I have lived every day since," he said, his voice a raw whisper, "trying to be the man I was not then, trying to stand between the wolves and the lambs. I buried that deputy's badge with them. The law did not save them. I did not save them." He looked at her, his expression filled with a terrible, bleak honesty. "But I cannot save everybody." The confession, ripped from the deepest part of his soul, left him exposed, vulnerable. He had finally shown her the wound that drove him, the failure that he could never outrun. Clara felt a wave of overwhelming compassion. She saw him not as a stone, but as a man shattered by grief, who had painstakingly rebuilt himself into a shield to protect others from the pain that had destroyed his own world. She moved closer to him, the space between them disappearing. She slowly raised her hand and placed it flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, heavy beat beneath her palm. It was the heart of a man who felt everything. "You saved me," she said, her voice soft but certain. The words a simple, profound truth. He might not have been able to save his wife and son, but his quest for redemption had led him to her. In saving her, he had not erased his past, but he had given meaning to his present. And in that small, cold cave, surrounded by the howling wind and the endless snow, that was everything. The thaw came 2 days later, a slow, grudging retreat of the cold. The world began to weep, the snow shrinking away from the tree trunks and melting into a greasy, treacherous slush underfoot. The wind died down, and the silence that remained was broken by the steady drip of water from the pines and the gurgle of unseen creeks coming back to life. For Eli and Clara, the end of the storm meant the end of their fragile sanctuary. Their food was gone, and the cold had sapped their strength. They had to move. Their goal was a town called Mineral Creek, a small mining settlement a few days' journey down the other side of the range. It was a long shot, but according to Samuel, it was the closest place with a telegraph station. Eli's plan was to wire the U.S. Marshals in Santa Fe. He knew a man there, a man who would listen. It was their only hope of bringing a permanent end to the pursuit of Silas and his men. The descent from the high country was a miserable, exhausting ordeal. The horses struggled in the sucking mud and slick, half-frozen ground. Every step was a risk, a potential for a broken leg or a disastrous fall. They moved in a bubble of shared silence, the confessions of their night in the cave hanging between them, a new and delicate thread that had not yet been tested by the harshness of the world. Clara's hand on Eli's chest, his raw words about his wife and child, these things had changed the very air they breathed. They were no longer just a man and the woman he had rescued. They were two people who had seen the deepest wounds in each other's souls. Clara found her own strength growing in the wake of their shared vulnerability. She no longer felt like a passenger in her own survival. When they started out that first morning, Eli, weakened by hunger, swayed in the saddle, without a word. Clara had dismounted and brought him a handful of snow to wet his lips, her hand steady on his arm as he recovered. A small gesture, but it was a profound shift. She was no longer just being protected. She was helping to protect. They were 2 days down from the cave, following a narrow, winding trail that hugged the side of a steep canyon. When their luck ran out, the landscape was a jumble of jagged rocks and stunted, wind-twisted pines, a perfect place for an ambush. Eli, ever watchful, felt at first a subtle change in the air, a wrongness. He reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the rocks above them. "What is it?" Clara whispered, bringing her own horse to a halt beside him. Before he could answer, a voice echoed from the rocks above, a familiar, hated sound that made Clara's blood run cold. Well, look what the thaw washed up." It was Silas. He stepped into view on a high ledge, a rifle held loosely in his hands. The man with the tangled beard appeared beside him, and 2 others fanned out along the ridge. They had them trapped. The trail was too narrow to turn and flee, with a sheer rock wall on one side and a precipitous drop on the other. "Nowhere left to run. Harper," Silas called down, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "I'll give you this. You led us on a merry chase, but it ends here. Give me the girl, and I might just let you ride away." Eli's face was a granite mask. His hand rested on the butt of his Colt. "That is not going to happen, Silas." "I figured you would say that," Silas sneered. He raised his rifle. "Pity." The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Eli reacted with the preternatural speed of a man who had lived his life on the edge of violence, in a single, fluid motion. He drew his revolver and shoved Clara from her horse, pushing her toward the meager cover of a rocky outcrop on the side of the trail. "Stay down," he roared, his own body shielding her for a split second before he swung back around, his Colt bucking in his hand. One of the men on the ridge cried out and staggered back, clutching his arm, but the volume of fire was too great. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off the rocks with angry, buzzing sounds. Clara's horse, struck by a stray shot, screamed and fell, blocking the trail behind them. Gideon, Eli's steady gelding, reared in terror. Clara huddled behind the rock, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw Eli, a blur of motion, firing, reloading, a solitary figure of defiance against impossible odds. He was trying to give her a chance to find better cover, to scramble further into the rocks. He was drawing all their fire. Then she saw it happen. A puff of dust and fabric erupted from his side. He grunted a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and his body staggered, his legs buckling beneath him. He fired one last shot toward the ridge before he collapsed, falling heavily in the muddy trail. "No!" The scream was torn from Clara's throat, a sound of pure anguish. The firing from above faltered, the attackers surprised by their sudden success. In that momentary lull, instinct took over. The world narrowed for Clara. All her fear and helplessness burned away by a singular, desperate purpose: Eli. She scrambled from behind the rock, ignoring the renewed shouts from above. She reached his side, her hands finding the warm, sticky wetness of his blood soaking through his coat. His face was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes were open, but they were unfocused, glazed with pain and shock. "Eli," she pleaded, her voice breaking. A bullet kicked up dirt beside her head, and she knew they had seconds. He was too heavy to lift. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, surged through her. She grabbed the collar of his thick coat with both hands, dug her heels into the mud, and pulled. Her muscles screamed in protest. He was impossibly heavy, but the image of his face, pale and bleeding, fueled a strength she did not know she possessed. She pulled, her feet slipping in the mud, her breath coming in great, tearing gasps. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, off the exposed trail and into the deeper shadows of the rocks. Another volley of shots followed them, the bullets chewing at the rock face just above their heads, showering them with stone splinters. She found a narrow crevice, a deep fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for them to squeeze into. She managed to pull him inside, his body half slumped against hers, before collapsing against the cold stone, her chest heaving, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. Outside, she could hear Silas shouting orders. For a few terrifying moments, she thought they would come down and finish the job, but the terrain was treacherous, and with one of their own wounded, they were hesitant to press their advantage into the unknown maze of rocks. She heard them arguing, their voices fading as they apparently decided to retreat and wait them out. They knew he was wounded. They knew they were trapped. They had time. As their voices faded, an eerie silence descended once more, broken only by Eli's labored breathing and the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness of the crevice. Clara's terror receded, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He was alive. For now. And it was up to her to keep him that way. For 3 days, the world was a blur of fear, exhaustion, and a desperate, clinging hope. She managed to drag him deeper into the fissure, which opened into a small, cave-like chamber, hidden from view and sheltered from the elements. She tore strips from her own petticoat to press against his wound, a dark, ugly hole in his side that oozed blood with every pained breath he took. The bullet was still inside him, a poison she had no way of removing. All she could do was try to stop the bleeding and fight the fever that she knew would come. The first day was a battle against the bleeding and the cold. She built a tiny, smokeless fire from dry twigs she found at the back of the cave, shielding its meager light with her own body. She ventured out only once, a frantic, terrifying scramble in the twilight to retrieve their canteens and the saddlebags from Eli's dead horse. Her heart in her throat with every shadow. She found a small pouch of herbs in Eli's bag, things Ruth had pressed on them before they left. She recognized the feathery leaves of yarrow and the papery bark of willow. "For bleeding," Ruth had said of the yarrow. "For fever," she had said of the willow. She made a poultice of the crushed yarrow leaves, packing it against his wound with a prayer on her lips. She brewed a bitter, dark tea from the willow bark, forcing the lukewarm liquid past his lips, a few drops at a time. By the second day, the fever had taken hold. His skin was burning to the touch, yet he shivered uncontrollably. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind lost in a delirious landscape of pain and memory. He would murmur names she did not know. "Sarah," he would whisper, his voice filled with a terrible, aching love. "Thomas," he would cry out, as if trying to ward off some unseen danger. Clara sat beside him, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth, her own exhaustion a dull, constant ache. She knew she had to keep him awake, to keep him tethered to the world of the living. So she talked. She filled the silence of the cave with the only thing she had to offer, her own story. She told him stories she had not thought of in years, memories of a life before the darkness. She spoke of her father, the preacher, not of his death, but of his life. "He had a voice like warm honey," she whispered, her own voice hoarse from fatigue. When he read from the Bible, it was not about fire and damnation. It was about peace. He used to let me sit in his study, in a big leather chair that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke. I would read his books for hours. I wanted to see the world he read about. She told him of her dreams, the simple, innocent dreams of a girl who had not yet been taught to be afraid. I read a book once about the ocean. I have never seen it, but the book said it was a blue so big you could not see the other side. I used to dream of standing on the shore, of feeling the water on my feet. I wanted to see if it was really that big. She talked for hours, her voice a low, steady murmur, a lifeline cast into the darkness of his fever. She spoke of the scent of her mother's baking, of the feel of her favorite dress, of a stray dog she had once befriended. She was not just telling him stories. She was reclaiming her own past, piecing together the girl she had been, the girl who had been buried under so much pain and shame. Sometimes, in a moment of fleeting clarity, his eyes would focus on her. He would not speak, but he would watch her, a flicker of recognition in their fever-bright depths. And in those moments, and in the depths of his delirium, he would whisper her name. "Clara," he would murmur, the sound a dry rustle in his throat. It was not a call for help, not a question. It was a statement, an anchor. He would say it like a prayer, the one solid thing in a world that was coming apart. And every time he said it, her resolve hardened. She would not let him die. On the third night, the fever reached its peak. His breathing was shallow, his body rigid with shivers. Clara was sure she was losing him. She spent the entire night bathing his skin with melted snow, forcing more of the willow bark tea down his throat, and whispering to him, pleading with him to stay, to fight. Just before dawn, something shifted. The violent shivers subsided, replaced by a deep, drenching sweat. His breathing, which had been so shallow, grew deeper, more even. She laid a hand on his forehead. It was still hot, but the raging fire was gone. It was cool and damp with sweat. The fever had broken. Exhaustion, profound and absolute, washed over her. She slumped against the cave wall beside him, her head falling back against the cold stone. And for the first time in 3 days, she slept. She awoke to the feeling of a hand on her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open. It was late afternoon on the 4th day. Eli was awake. He was weak, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes were clear. He was looking at her, not with the haze of fever, but with a look of such raw, aching tenderness that it made her breath catch. His hand was unsteady, his touch feather-light on her skin. He looked around the small cave, at the remnants of the fire, at the blood-stained bandages on his side, and then back at her exhausted, grime-streaked face. He understood what she had done. He saw the fight she had waged for him, for them. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. The same words she had spoken to him in that other cave, now returned to her. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a deep, overwhelming relief. She leaned into his touch, her cheek pressing against his palm. "I told you I would," she whispered back, though she had never said the words, only felt them. He did not have the strength to sit up, but he slowly, with great effort, raised his head from the ground. She met him halfway, leaning down toward him. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the dim, quiet light of the cave. They shared a kiss. It was not a kiss of pity for the wounded, nor a desperate clinging of the terrified. It was something else entirely. It was achingly slow, a tentative, gentle meeting of lips, chapped and dry from fever and dehydration. It was reverent, a silent acknowledgement of the profound bond that had been forged between them, a bond of shared survival, of wounds seen and tended, of souls laid bare. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and willow bark and the faintest, undeniable spark of a future they had fought for and won. It was real. His recovery was slow, a painstaking process measured in sips of water and then broth she made from snared rabbits. For days, he was too weak to stand, but with each passing day, A little more of his strength returned. He would watch her as she moved about the small cave, his gaze filled with a quiet awe. The roles had been completely reversed. He, the strong protector, was now the one in need of care, and she, the fragile rescue, had become his fierce, capable guardian. A week after he was shot, he was strong enough to walk, albeit with his arms slung over her shoulders, his body leaning heavily against hers. It was time to move. Silas and his men could not be far. They emerged from the cave, blinking in the thin, watery sunlight. The world was still a harsh and dangerous place, but as they began their slow, painful journey down the mountain, leaning on each other for support, it was a world they now faced together. The journey to Mineral Creek was a pilgrimage of pain. Each step Eli took was a fresh argument with the wound in his side, a dull, fiery protest that he met with a stoic, iron-willed silence. Clara was his crutch, his brace, his constant shadow. She walked beside him, his arm draped over her shoulders, her small frame taking on a surprising amount of his weight. The roles had been so completely reversed that at times it felt like a dream. She was the one who found water, the one who scanned the trail ahead, the one whose quiet, steady presence kept him moving forward when exhaustion threatened to drag him under. Mineral Creek was not a town built on hope, but on the desperate, feverish greed for whatever silver could be clawed from the surrounding mountains. It clung to the side of a canyon, a disorderly collection of unpainted shacks, saloons, and a single, muddy street that served as its main artery. The faces of the men they passed were hard and suspicious, their eyes holding the dull glint of disappointment or the sharp, wary look of men who guarded their small claims with paranoia. It was a place without softness, a town that felt raw and temporary, as if it could be washed away by the next hard rain. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, a small, grimy building with a sagging porch. The man behind the desk was a surprise. He was not the portly, lazy lawman of Red Creek, but a thin, weasel-faced man with a meticulously oiled mustache and eyes that were too close together. He listened to Eli's story, a story delivered in short, clipped sentences, his breath still shallow from the effort of their long walk. The sheriff, whose name was Barlow, stroked his mustache and showed an unnerving lack of surprise. "Silas, you say?" Barlow said, his tone one of mild interest, as if they were discussing the weather. "Runs a string of girls and whiskey up and down the territory. Yes, I have heard of him." "He and his men ambushed us up in the high country," Eli said, his voice flat. "They murdered a good man and his wife back at the Miller Ranch. I need to use your telegraph. I have to wire the Utes marshals in Santa Fe." Sheriff Barlow leaned back in his chair, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his thin lips. "Now that is where you have a problem, friend. The telegraph line came down in the storm 2 weeks ago. Might be another month before the repair crew gets up this way." He held up his hands in a gesture of feigned helplessness. "My hands are tied." Clara watched him, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He was lying. She did not know how she knew, but she did. There was an ease to his deception, a slickness that spoke of long practice. His eyes kept flicking to the door, as if he were expecting someone. "Then give us a place to stay," Eli said, his patience wearing thin. "A room where we can be safe until I am strong enough to ride for the nearest working line." "Safe?" Barlow chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Friend, this is Mineral Creek. The only safe place is the graveyard." His eyes slid over to Clara, a greasy, appraising look that made her skin crawl. "But I will see what I can do. There is an old miner's cabin at the edge of town. You can have it for the night, on me." The offer of charity felt more like a threat, but they were exhausted, and Eli was in no condition to argue. Barlow led them to a dilapidated shack that was little more than 4 walls and a leaky roof. As the sheriff was leaving, a man came riding down the street, one of Silas's men, the one with the tangled, black beard. He saw them, and his eyes widened in recognition. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Sheriff Barlow before riding on toward the largest saloon. The exchange was over in a second, but Clara saw it all. The sheriff had not seen her looking. He turned back to them, his smile wider now. "You just rest up," he said. "I will make sure no one bothers you." As soon as he was gone, Clara turned to Eli, her eyes wide with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as ice. "He is one of them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The sheriff. He is in league with Silas. This is not a shelter. Eli, it is a cage." Eli, who had slumped onto a rickety cot, looked at her. He had seen the nod as well, the last of his hope. The hope that the law might finally be on their side died in his eyes. They were alone, wounded, and cornered in a town that had already sold them out. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled in the small, dusty room. But then Clara straightened up. Something inside her, something forged in the fire of the last few weeks, refused to break. She had nursed this man back from the brink of death. She had faced down her own nightmares. She had pulled a trigger to protect the innocent. She was no longer the terrified girl who hid behind Eli's coat. "No," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a new, unyielding strength. "I am done being cornered. I am done being the prey." She looked at Eli, her expression fierce and determined. "You taught me how to survive out there. Now I'm going to choose the fight." Before he could protest, she laid out her plan, her words coming in a torrent of desperate, brilliant strategy. There was a narrow box canyon a few miles south of town, a place they had passed on their way in. She remembered Eli noting it, saying it was a natural trap, a place where a few men could hold off 100. "I will ride out alone," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "I will ride toward the saloon, make sure they all see me. Then I will ride out of town, south. They will think I am running, that I have abandoned you. They will come after me. All of them. They will be so sure of themselves. They will be careless. I will lead them into that canyon." "Clara, no," Eli said, trying to push himself up. The effort cost him, and he fell back, a grimace of pain on his face. "It is too dangerous. I will not let you." "You will not let me?" she asked, her voice softening. She knelt beside the cot and took his hand. "Eli, look at me. I am not that girl anymore. You have to trust me. This is the only way. We cannot fight the whole town. We have to draw them out, onto our ground." She squeezed his hand. "You just need to be there when I lead them into the trap. That is all I ask." He looked into her eyes, and he saw not a frightened girl, but a woman of terrifying resolve. He saw the survivor Ruth had spoken of. He saw the fighter he had told her she was. And in that moment, he knew he could not stop her. To do so would be to deny the very person she had fought so hard to become. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. An hour later, Clara rode out of the shack on Gideon, Eli's steady horse. She had taken Eli's spare pistol, tucking it into the waistband of her dress. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs, but her hands on the reins were steady. She rode slowly down the main street, past the saloon. She saw them through the window, Silas, his arm in a sling, the bearded man, and a half-dozen others, drinking and laughing. Their laughter died as they saw her. Silas's face contorted with rage and triumph. She did not look at them. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead and urged Gideon into a canter, heading south out of town. She did not need to look back to know they were coming. She could feel their greed, their hate, a palpable force at her back. The ride to the canyon was the longest few miles of her life. The setting sun cast long, menacing shadows across the landscape. She was a lone rider, a single, small figure in a vast, hostile world. It was a terrifying echo of how she had felt for so long. But this time was different. This time, she was not just fleeing. She was leading. She reached the mouth of the canyon. a narrow slit in a high wall of red rock, and rode inside without slowing. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, the trail at the bottom just wide enough for 2 horses to ride abreast. It twisted and turned, a natural maze. She rode for another quarter-mile, to a spot Eli had described, a sharp bend in the trail marked by a single, lightning-scarred pine tree. There, she dismounted, pulled the pistol from her waistband, and flattened herself against the rock wall, her breath held tight in her chest. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of their horses echoing off the canyon walls, the sound of their confident, cruel voices. They rode into the canyon with a reckless arrogance, Silas in the lead. They were not expecting a fight. They were expecting a prize. As they rounded the bend by the pine tree, the world erupted. A single rifle shot cracked from the rocks high above them, and the lead rider, not Silas, but the bearded man, was thrown from his saddle. Eli, his face a pale, determined mask, was wedged into a crevice, his rifle resting on a ledge. The sudden attack threw the gang into chaos. Their horses reared and screamed in the narrow space before they could recover. Another shot, this one from behind them, near the canyon mouth, took down another man. Samuel Miller, his face grim, stepped out from behind a boulder. He and Ruth had followed them, unable to let Eli and Clara face this danger alone. The canyon had become a killing box. The gang was trapped between Eli's rifle above and Samuel's below. Panic replaced their arrogance. They scrambled for cover, firing wildly, their bullets sparking off the rocks. Clara, her heart pounding, saw her moment amid the chaos. 2 of the men had dismounted and were trying to scramble up the scree slope, trying to get a better angle on Eli's position. They were making their way toward her hiding place. She raised her pistol with both hands, the way Eli had shown her. Her target was a man climbing the rocks, his back to her. She fired. The shot went wide, but the man froze, turning to see where it had come from. He saw her, and a look of stunned disbelief crossed his face before he raised his own pistol. Before he could fire, another shot rang out, this one from close by. The man crumpled and slid down the rocks. Ruth, her face a mask of fierce determination, stood 20 paces away, a smoking shotgun in her hands. The fight was brutal and short, trapped and outmaneuvered. The gang was decimated. In minutes, only Silas was left. His horse shot out from under him, his pistol empty. He stood alone amid the dust and the smoke and the bodies of his men, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw, animal fear. He saw Clara then, standing with Ruth, and a last, desperate surge of hatred propelled him forward. He pulled a knife from his belt and lunged at her. Clara stood her ground, her empty pistol held before her like a shield. But she was too slow. He was almost on her when a body slammed into him from the side, sending them both tumbling to the ground. It was Eli. He had scrambled down from his perch, his wounded side screaming in protest, to throw himself in front of her. The 2 men rolled in the dust, a tangle of limbs and desperation. Eli was weaker, but he fought with a cold, desperate fury. He finally gained the upper hand, his fist connecting with Silas's jaw with a sickening crack. Silas went limp, the fight knocked out of him. Eli rose unsteadily to his feet, his chest heaving, a fresh stain of blood spreading across the bandage at his side. He looked down at Silas, who was now on his knees, his face a bloody mask, begging. "Mercy," Silas choked out, spittle and blood flecking his lips. "Please, mercy." Eli stared at him, his face unreadable. Clara saw the universe of pain and rage that swirled in his eyes. She saw the memory of his wife and his son. She saw the old Eli, the man driven by a righteous vengeance, the man who would have ended this right here, with one final, deserved bullet. He raised his Colt, the barrel steady on Silas's forehead. The canyon fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the survivors. But then Eli's gaze shifted and he looked at Clara, He saw her standing there, alive, breathing, her face filled with a mixture of terror and awe. He saw not the ghost of the woman he had lost, but the living, breathing woman he had found. The fury in his eyes slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, weary calm. He lowered the pistol. He stared at the pathetic, broken man at his feet for a long moment, and then he turned and walked away. "Justice will find you," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. He did not need to be its instrument. Not anymore. Clara watched him, tears streaming down her face, cutting clean paths through the grime and gunpowder on her cheeks. He walked to her, and she saw the man he had become. The burden of vengeance had been lifted. The ghost that had driven him for so long had finally been laid to rest. "You are not who you were," she said, her voice filled with wonder. He stopped in front of her, his body bloodied and dust-covered, but his eyes clearer than she had ever seen them. He looked at her, at the woman who had ridden into a canyon to face down her demons, and he saw the same profound transformation. "Neither are you," he said, months later. The first snows of winter were beginning to dust the high peaks. On a piece of land not far from the miller's ranch, a small cabin stood newly built, its pine logs still smelling of the forest. The nights were long and the world was still a harsh and unforgiving place. But inside the small cabin, there was warmth in the firelight. There was peace. One night, as the fire crackled in the stone hearth, Clara moved about the small room, preparing for bed. She slowly began to unbutton her dress, her movements unhurried and graceful. Eli, sitting in a chair by the fire, watched her for a moment. Then, out of an old, ingrained habit of respect for the pain she had endured, he began to turn his back, to give her the privacy he always had. But this time, her voice, soft and sure in the quiet of the room, stopped him. "Stay." And he did. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you. So please comment with where you are listening from, and subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.